Please have your seat. We will announce the President soon. Il Presidente. Asseyez-vous, merci.
Please be seated.
D'abord, quelques communications.
I have a few announcements to make, first of all, about the languages for this conference. You can listen and speak French, English, German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. Following the opening ceremony, which will conclude at 3:30, we will have a family photograph taken, and I would ask speakers to leave the tribune and to join us for that. Following the family photograph, there will be three round table discussions: peace, security, democracy and human rights and good governance, which will be in EHSA 0112. And then inclusive growth and sustainability will be in the hemicycle. The third table round on immigration, youth and human development will be in PHS 4B001. There will be ushers who will direct you to your round table discussion, and then we will come back here for the closing ceremony. And speaking time will be roughly 7 minutes per person. And I would ask those managing the roundtable discussions to ensure that the timing is respected. President of the Central African Republic, Mr. Touadéra. Madam High Representative, who is arriving, Mrs. Mogherini. President of the Pan-African Parliament, Mr. Nkodo Dank. Mr. Hoyer, President of the EIB, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mali, Mr. Diop, European Commissioner, Mr. Oettinger, President of the ACP EU Delegation, Louis Michel, Excellencies, dear colleagues, the friends of Europe and Africa, it's a genuine pleasure to see this hemicycle so full for such an important subject, namely our partnership with our African brothers. A week ago in Abidjan, in a week's time in Abidjan on the Ivory Coast, the AU-EU summit will take place. And I think this will be a different summit from summits that have been held in the past. It has to conclude with tangible results and a clear and precise roadmap. Today we have the honor of having with us the President of the Central African Republic and numerous leaders from the African continent. All of this shows the very clear determination of the European Parliament to establish direct, high-level dialogue with African leaders. Because, as I have always said, we should see Africa through African eyes, and that can only be done through direct and frank dialogue between equals. We started this dialogue by inviting the presidents of the African Union Commission as well as the president of the Ivory Coast to the plenary. This will continue in the future. The European Parliament has decided to organize its African Week of Parliamentary Work, and today's conference should be seen as a part of this, with the intention of ensuring that Africa is put at the heart of our political agenda. I'd like to thank my parliamentary colleagues who've committed themselves so successfully to Africa. If I may, I would now like to switch to my mother tongue, Italian. For many years, the Union didn't see Africa and pay it the necessary attention that it should have done. Often we looked elsewhere. uncaring of the humanitarian disasters, the climate disasters, the security emergencies that were afflicting the continent, without being really aware of the fact that Africa is one of our primary strategic interests. Europe acted on different fronts, defending different interests and agendas, and the result was many good intentions, but with many opportunities that were wasted and with very few results, without having input into the future of the continent. Globalization and migratory flows have shown that putting up walls and barriers is not the solution. The problems of Africa are also the problems of Europe. It's time for a new start before it's too late. Our links are not just geographical in nature. We have shared interests and challenges facing us. By 2050, the African population will double and will be more than 2.5 billion people. This demographic explosion could be a problem, but could also be an opportunity. Desertification, famine, pandemics, unemployment, malgovernance all increase instability and encourage untrammeled immigration. Without robust action to counter these phenomena, the new generations will move to Europe looking for hope and looking for a future, attracted sometimes by images that they've seen on TV and the internet, something that seems therefore to them to be the promised land. It is vital that we provide answers to them and help them to decide to stay to solve the problems of their own lands. The European citizens want a stronger European Union which can manage migratory flows and guarantee security. They want us to defend our values, welcoming newcomers, whilst being firm in stopping people who have no right to be in Europe from being here. We do not want uncontrolled migratory flows. We do not want thousands of people dying in the deserts. We do not want people in despair because they cannot feed their children. In the short term, we have to step up border controls and better manage asylum requests and manage the impact of immigration. Europe has to use the same kind of funds as it did for the Balkans to close the central Mediterranean corridor and to combat terrorism in Libya, Tunisia, Niger, Chad and Mali, for example. And I would like to express my thanks to the ministers of the government of Mali, which is in the first line fighting the terrorism of ISIS. And the Sahel G5 is an excellent example of regional cooperation which should be reinforced by Europe. Funds will be used to train border guards, security forces, and can also be used to set up centres under the UN which will provide humanitarian protection, food, drugs and assistance for children, and where asylum requests can be processed. Internal borders are not sufficient to manage migratory flows. They're just a form of propaganda. Instead, we need better funding for the coast guards of the European Union, who should have more resources available to them. The European satellite systems, Copernicus and Galileo, as well as the development of new security tools, should be used along these lines. It is also vital that we harmonise the conditions for obtaining asylum and repatriation as well, which need to be rapid and effective. In its last session in Strasbourg, Parliament voted through the broad majority a mandate to profoundly overhaul the Dublin regulation to make it fairer and more effective and show more solidarity. Now it's up to the Council to adopt its position. But none of this is enough. We need to tackle the problems at the roots. because unless stability and prosperity are a possibility, we won't see tens of thousands of people leaving their lands. We'll see millions of men and women doing so. The UN estimates that in the short term, more than 500,000 of people per year will be trying to find a better future in Europe. Supporting Africa, therefore, is not just a means of showing responsibility. It's very much mutually in our economic and political interest to do so. Many African countries have already proven that their continent offers genuine opportunities. In 2016, 5 African economies were in the top 10 in growth terms in the world, with growth rates higher than 7%. In Africa, there are raw materials that are of critical interest for our industry. 64% of cobalt, for example, comes from the Congo, and that's vital for the batteries used in electric cars. And then we've got tantalum in Rwanda for solar panels, platinum in South Africa to reduce emissions from cars. All of these are raw materials that are of interest to our competitors, starting with China, which is trying to obtain a dominant position to reinforce its own industry. There's also the question of environmental sustainability, thanks to the partnership on raw materials, which I promoted as Commissioner for Industry in 2012. There's cooperation between the geological services of the EU and Africa, which has led to innovation and better respect of the environment. It would be possible to quote many other good examples of our work with Africa, starting with the integration of markets and the Lomé and Cotonou agreements, both of which have had positive results. These agreements have made it possible to have free access to the European market for 99.5% of African products. Post-Cotonou discussions are underway, and I'd like to thank the rapporteurs of the Parliament for their contribution. In spite of these efforts and tens of millions invested, ensuring a dignified lifestyle and more security for the people of Africa is something that will still take much time. Many areas of Africa are afflicted by conflicts, instability, terrorism, and malgovernance. We just need to think about what's happening in Zimbabwe, the Horn of Africa, or the Central African Republic. According to the World Bank, the GDP of all of the African countries in 2015 was only slightly higher than that of France. In spite of the dramatic figures for infant mortality, 38% of the newborns born in the world in 2015, the African population also has the highest growth rate. We're a long way from the UN Sustainable Development Goals to reduce poverty, though. 1/3 of Africans are below the poverty threshold. 1/6 need humanitarian assistance. In rural areas, 60% of inhabitants live on less than €1 a day. Agriculture and raw materials, including energy, are the main economic sources, whereas the level of industrialization is extremely low. Last Monday was the International Day for the Industrialization of Africa. Once again, it was underlined how important growth and jobs are, and that these can only be created through a strong industrial base. Only 15% have internet at home. Only 1 person in 3 has electricity. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest illiteracy rates in the world. 1 child in 5 doesn't go to school. Almost 60% of adolescents don't go to school. So we shouldn't be surprised if young Africans feel they have nothing to lose and decide to risk their lives to come to Europe if they are seduced by those that preach violence in the name of God. Many problems could be resolved with greater investment in education, infrastructure, industry, and a modern agriculture. And Africa is the continent that attracts by far the least investment, just 80 billion a year, just 3% of GDP. China is the country that proportionately is investing the most increasingly. The future of Africa has to be in the hands of Africans, obviously, but Europe as a friend should be doing its part. We should be working together on a level playing field. We should be pooling our leadership in technologies, in quality, in industrial savoir-faire and training. 10 years have passed since the EU-Africa strategy was developed. Unfortunately, many expectations were disappointed, and Europe wasn't courageous enough to develop genuinely effective instruments. Instead of consolidating our position as a main partner, we are losing ground not only to China but to emerging investors such as Turkey, India and Singapore, who are reinforcing their own influence. The fifth summit between the EU and the AU on the 29th and 30th of November in Abidjan, where more than 80 heads of state will be present, is taking place at a crucial point in time. We have to set an unequivocal signal of our determination to relaunch and reinforce this partnership, speaking with a single, united and credible voice. The guiding thread for our action has to be our action for young people. They're the key to a continent that will be more stable, more prosperous and more modern. The investment plan for Africa, 3.4 billion euros, is an important step in the right direction, but it's a long way from being sufficient. The continent's efforts to develop a sustainable industrial base, efficient agriculture, renewable energy sources, infrastructure that's appropriate for water, for energy, mobility, logistics and digital market have to be supported through a Marshall Plan. We need to reinforce governance and the rule of law, the fight against corruption, emancipation of women and education. We have to work to ensure that the next budget of the EU will allocate at least 40 billion to investment in Africa. Thanks to the efforts and synergies with the EIB, we should be able to mobilize public and private investment amounting to around 500 billion. On this basis, we will be able to have economic diplomacy promoting integration of markets, transfer of technology and savoir-faire, sustainability and training. The goal is to have a favorable environment for the development of a manufacturing base, for entrepreneurship, for SMEs and for youth work to be developed. And Erasmus is a very useful tool which should be extended to Africa. In parallel, we need legal quotas for immigration, which will satisfy demand in certain sectors of the EU and will also ensure that companies can have apprentices in Africa. We need academic and cultural diplomacy, which will mean that more African students can study in Europe, reinforcing Erasmus again. So my conclusion is, it's not enough to just increase resources. Today, we invest 33 billion from the EU budget without counting the bilateral contributions from member states. If that generosity of taxpayers hasn't produced the expected results, we have to, I think, question the validity of the current cooperation and development model. Just continuing with business as usual would be a mistake. Citizens want a political Europe which can make courageous choices, starting with the budget, which shouldn't just repeat what already exists, but should reflect the priorities of the peoples of Europe. The 40 billion proposed, 12 times higher than the current amount in the investment plans, are vital to ensure that we actually have an impact in line with our goals. It's a critical mass sufficient to catalyse public and private investment in Europe. This is not utopia. If there's the political determination, the money will be found, partly using better the funds already planned for Europe and partly through using the own resources of the European Union. But this should not be a burden on SMEs and citizens. Instead, as Parliament has requested, we should be thinking about how we can raise new community resources. I think we should start to think about how we can recover money from people who aren't paying taxes. And I'm thinking of tax havens, and I'm thinking of major multinationals who do not always pay what they should. Today, the European Parliament is committing itself to developing a new central role as a partner with Africa. Our debate has to prepare for Abidjan, involving young people, political leaders, experts, investors, Europeans and Africans. This should be a point where we could relaunch our partnership, not just a formal conference where we read out speeches, not at all. If our partnership is genuinely a priority, we should be meeting more regularly, every 2 years. And I'm thinking every 2 years would be about the right time frame, with follow-up meetings at different levels, including civil society on a regular basis. So Abidjan should really be a new starting point for our relations. Thank you for listening.
Je donne tout de suite la parole au président.
Let me now give the floor to the President of the Central African Republic, Mr. Faustin Archange Touadéra.
Monsieur le Président du Parlement européen,
President of the European Parliament, High Representative, Vice President of the European Commission, President of the Pan-African Parliament, President of the European Investment Bank, Mr. Louis Michel, Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'm taking the floor in front of this august assembly of distinguished personalities as a representative of the Central African Republic. I'm bringing the voice of my people to the nations of the world, and I'd like to welcome the constant expressions of solidarity that we've heard vis-à-vis ourselves. Now, we face immense challenges on a daily basis, but in spite of that, we have refused to give in to fatality. And we have decided to do what we can, to do what our best to build a fairer, more peaceful, more prosperous and more fraternal world. It is the eve of the Abidjan meeting, during which the countries of the African Union will meet their partners of the European Union. And so it's